The pianist died at noon, yet someone heard him play at dusk. Welcome to Detective Echoes. Where are you tuning in from as the game begins? Your curiosity keeps this investigation alive. Now, the case unfolds. It was on a bleak November afternoon that the peculiar case of the pianist who played his final note twice first came to our attention. The fire crackled gently in our Baker Street sitting room, and I, Dr. John Watson, was attempting to find a moment's respite with the evening edition of the Times, when Sherlock Holmes, restless as ever, stood by the window, pipe clenched between his teeth, his gaze fixed upon the fog that veiled the city. "It is curious," he muttered suddenly, "more to the room than to me. One would expect the post to arrive punctually, and yet nothing." "You are anticipating something of importance?" I asked, folding the paper and setting it aside. "Merely a letter, Watson, but from a man who does not write unless driven by forces beyond the ordinary. And if I am not mistaken—" He turned abruptly toward the door just as a sharp knock echoed from the hallway. Mrs. Hudson's footsteps followed promptly, and a moment later she entered with her usual quiet efficiency. "Gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes. A Mr. Clement Rowe seems quite urgent." Holmes raised a brow and took the card from her hand. "Thank you, Mrs. Hudson. Send him in." Moments later, a pale, finely dressed man stepped into our parlor. His eyes, though calm at first glance, held a glint of quiet desperation. He was perhaps in his late 30s, with the bearing of someone accustomed to drawing-room receptions and the steady discipline of musical performance. "Mr. Holmes," he began, removing his gloves, "I apologize for arriving unannounced. My name is Clement Rowe. I am the principal accompanist at the Royal Academy of Music." Holmes motioned him to a seat. "And yet, your note was far from musical, Mr. Rowe. Please go on." Rowe took a breath. "I come to you regarding the death of my dear friend and colleague Felix Mayer. He was one of the finest concert pianists in England, some say in all of Europe. He was found dead last evening, slumped over the keyboard in the conservatory of his Kensington home." Holmes leaned forward, interested. "Heart failure, I presume?" "That is what the police have suggested," Rowe replied carefully. "There were no marks of violence, no signs of struggle. He had been composing into the late hours, as he often did. But there is something I cannot explain. I was the last to see him alive, and I heard something I should not have." I could see Holmes's eyes narrow slightly. His interest piqued. "Do continue." "I left his home just after 10. We had played through a sonata he was preparing for debut, a composition of his own, deeply melancholic. He was unusually tense that evening, but I thought it no more than nerves. At exactly 10:15 I was crossing the mews at the back of his property when I heard it." "Heard what?" "The final bar of the sonata. It was unmistakable, his signature flourish, but he had already played it in my presence. That night I heard it a second time moments after I had left. That was impossible, Mr. Holmes. Felix never repeated endings. He abhorred redundancy in performance." Holmes steepled his fingers. "And yet you are sure it was not a phonograph?" Rowe shook his head. "He loathed recorded music. He refused to even keep a phonograph in the house." "And no one else in the house?" "Only the housekeeper, Mrs. Glynn, who was asleep by that hour, and a part-time gardener who had left before dusk. The conservatory is separate from the main house, attached via a corridor that Felix kept locked while composing." Holmes tapped his fingers together, then rose to retrieve his violin, though he did not play. Instead, he held it loosely, pacing. "Watson," he said, turning toward me, "what is the most damning thing about a piece of music played twice?" I hesitated. "I'm not sure I follow." Holmes answered for me. "That it requires intent, especially when one swears never to repeat themselves. Either Felix Mayer broke his own rule, or someone else played his final note." Mr. Rowe sat stiffly. Are you suggesting someone returned after I left? I am suggesting, Holmes said slowly, that the final note was not played by the dead man, but by his murderer. We sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the faint ticking of the mantel clock. What did the police say, precisely? Holmes asked. They were content with the appearance of natural death. He was only 39, but they noted signs of strain, blood pressure concerns. He had complained of fainting spells. There was no investigation. And yet you believed. Something sinister had occurred. I did, still do. The man I knew was many things, but never careless. He took measures to keep his sanctuary secure. That someone could have entered, played that final phrase, and left unseen, it defies logic, and yet... His voice trembled. I heard it. I know I did. Holmes set down the violin gently. Then we shall go to Kensington, Mr. Rowe. Watson, your coat. We arrived at Felix Mere's residence in Kensington just past 3 o'clock that afternoon. The house, a modest but elegant Georgian affair, stood quiet behind iron gates. The conservatory, as Rowe had described, jutted out from the rear, a glass structure like a gloved hand reaching into the fog. Mrs. Glynn, the housekeeper, greeted us with red-rimmed eyes and tight lips. She spoke little but permitted us entry. The parlour was orderly, untouched. The conservatory, however, bore the weight of tragedy. Felix Mere's grand piano still stood under the glass dome, a single sheet of music resting upon the stand. The sun filtered through the fogged panes, casting ghostly shadows on the floor. A velvet chair remained pushed back slightly, just as he had likely left it. Holmes paced silently, then crouched near the base of the piano. What do you see? Holmes? I asked. He raised a hand for silence, then pointed. A scuff mark, barely visible on the floor, and near it, the smallest indentation in the carpet, where a different, heavier foot must have stood. 2 people, Watson, he said, not one. He then reached for the music sheet on the stand. It was titled Nocturne for an Absent Father, a dedication Felix had long intended but only recently dared commit to page. It ends, Holmes murmured, on a diminished 7th, a curious place to finish a lament. He turned toward Rowe. Mr. Rowe, did Felix ever allow others to perform his pieces? Never. He was possessive to the point of obsession. Holmes nodded. Then the fact that someone not only played, but played that note, implies a level of familiarity no outsider should possess. He tapped the final bar of the sheet. We are not looking for a stranger who broke in and killed a pianist. Watson. We are looking for a musician, one who knew the man intimately, and who dared to finish a sonata that was never meant to be repeated. As we left the conservatory, the wind outside stirred the bare branches into a whisper. Holmes stopped on the threshold and looked back. Twice played, he said, once in passion, once in murder. And with that cryptic observation, the game was truly afoot. The cold wind had grown stronger by the time we departed the conservatory and stepped back into the warmth of the late Felix Mere's study. Holmes, deep in thought, moved without a word toward a sideboard and picked up a glass paperweight, examining it absently before setting it back down with a faint clink. Mr. Clement Rowe followed close behind, his brow furrowed, clearly disturbed by Holmes's earlier remark about the murderer being a musician. Holmes, I ventured at last, you said there were 2 sets of movements near the piano, one presumably belonging to Mere. The other, would that have been Mr. Rowe's? Holmes gave me an approving glance but shook his head. No, Watson. Mr. Rowe, though he was present earlier in the evening, did not approach the piano again after their session. Is that not so, sir? Rowe nodded, subdued. Correct. After we concluded the piece, Felix asked me to let myself out while he made some adjustments to the manuscript. I left by the back garden gate. Just so, Holmes said. The scuff I noted at the base of the instrument bore traces of soot, faint but distinct, and it was pressed down into the rug at an angle inconsistent with Rowe's departure. Moreover, the presence of crushed grit near the indentation suggests an individual who entered after Rowe departed, likely from outside, and not through the main entrance. At this, Rowe's face grew pale. But no one else had access to that portion of the house. The corridor linking the conservatory to the main structure is kept locked from both sides. It was Felix's rule. He hated interruptions. "And the key?" Holmes asked, voice light but precise. Felix kept it on his person at all times. In fact, I saw it on the gold chain he wore tucked into his waistcoat that very evening. Holmes gave a small, almost imperceptible nod and moved across to the writing desk. He opened its top drawer with delicacy, revealing a few pages of musical notations, a velvet-lined compartment holding tuning forks, and, oddly enough, a brass skeleton key resting at the very bottom. He held it up to the light. "Well," he murmured, "either Mr. Mere had taken to keeping spares or someone left this behind in haste. Curious that it was not mentioned to the police." Rowe stared at it, incredulous. "That's not Felix's. His was heavier, ornate, engraved with the letter M, a gift from the Academy. This is a common copy." "Then someone had the means to enter through the locked corridor after all," I said. Holmes looked at me approvingly. "Quite right, Watson. And the presence of this key in the desk drawer, hidden though not expertly, suggests it was concealed in haste, most likely after the act. Our mysterious second player did not exit the same way they entered. They used the corridor and left the key behind. That, gentlemen, is a thread we shall follow." Holmes then turned to Mrs. Glynn, who stood wringing her hands in the hallway. Her weathered face was lined with concern. "Mrs. Glynn," he said gently, "do you recall anyone visiting Mr. Mere recently? Someone he may not have been eager to announce?" She hesitated. I don't rightly know, sir. Mr. Mere kept to himself, always working. But there was someone, a woman. I didn't see her, not clearly, but I heard her voice once, sharp, foreign-like, arguing with him in the garden late one afternoon, just once last week. She left in a fury, slammed the gate. Holmes brightened. "Did you hear what was said?" She shook her head. "Only snatches. Something about a last promise and Vienna. I remember that because I thought it odd. I didn't know Mr. Mere had ever been abroad." Rowe blinked. "He studied there briefly, at the conservatoire, but that was years ago. I never heard him mention Vienna again." Holmes's eyes gleamed with interest. "And did Mr. Mere have any close correspondence from those days? Other musicians?" "A few," Rowe replied. "But only one ever came up in recent memory, Lena Vogel, a pianist from Austria. They performed a duet once long ago. The critics were quite taken with her. She disappeared from the public stage rather abruptly. Some say she returned to Salzburg." Holmes made a note in his pocketbook. "A foreign woman, known to Mr. Mere, connected to his Vienna days, with reason to be angry, and possibly a skilled enough musician to duplicate his playing." Rose stood alarmed. "You're not suggesting she murdered him?" "I suggest nothing yet," Holmes replied coolly. "I observe, I collect. Only once all the pieces are set in their places. Do I allow the board to speak?" At that moment the muffled sound of footsteps approached. Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard, ever a thorny companion, entered the room with the air of a man out of breath and slightly annoyed. "Holmes," he said, "I thought I'd find you poking about. Can't let a death occur west of Oxford Street without you turning up, can we?" Holmes smiled thinly. "My dear Lestrade, always a pleasure. Come to tidy up what you believe is a case of overwork and natural causes." Lestrade scowled. Man was under strain, Played day and night. Doctor says his heart was weak. No signs of forced entry, no struggle. What else do you need? A key, Holmes said mildly. One that should not exist, a final note that should not have echoed, and a woman who left no name. Lestrade blinked. You think it's murder? I think, Holmes replied, that Mr. Mere died at the exact moment he should not have been playing. Lestrade glanced at me, then at Rowe. You support this theory, Doctor? I support that something is very wrong, I said simply, and Mr. Holmes has a nose for wrongness. Holmes turned once more to the desk, this time examining the velvet lining where the key had been hidden. He sniffed at it, rubbed a bit, between his fingers, and then, to my amazement, tasted a trace of the residue. Camphor oil, he said, used to soften brass mechanisms and keep them from squeaking, typically applied to worn keyholes, especially those of musical instruments. Or old doors, a performer's oil. He looked up at Lestrade. Tell me, Inspector, in your routine examination of the body, did anyone inspect Mr. Mere's fingertips? I believe so, Lestrade said. Why? Because if the second note was not played by him, his fingers should be cold, stiff, untouched since death. But if he played that final bar, whether by choice or duress, there will be wear, indentation, and heat in the tissues for some time after. Rowe exhaled sharply. Do you believe he was forced to play? Holmes did not answer directly. Instead, he crossed to the piano once more and touched a single key, letting the sound hang in the air. There is a truth in performance, he said quietly. You cannot force artistry, but you can coerce imitation, and there is one more person I should like to speak with before the day is done. Who? I asked. The neighbor, Holmes said. For a piece so bold, so sweeping, and so tragically final, surely someone else heard it too. Outside, the daylight had begun to pale as Holmes led us down the garden path to the neighboring residence, a tidy brick townhouse with ivy creeping up its face. The brass plate read, Mr. Ambrose Fielding, Professor of Theology. A man of habit, according to Mrs. Glynn, always home, always listening to his radio broadcasts or humming hymns in the garden. The door was opened by a gaunt, bald man in his 60s with an inquisitive gaze and a firm handshake. Yes, he said, when Holmes inquired about the night in question. I did hear something. A melody played with great sorrow. Around 10:15, I would say. It struck me because it ended with a note held far longer than it should have been, as though the performer's hand had remained. Just a second. Too long. Unnatural, I thought. Holmes was still for a moment. And you are sure it was not the same as earlier in the evening? Quite sure. The earlier performance, if it was the same piece, ended differently. Brisker, more confident. The final note I heard was, how can I describe it, lingering, as if wrung from reluctant fingers. Holmes nodded, satisfied. When we returned to Baker Street that evening, he sat silently by the fire, fingers steepled, eyes closed. Watson, he said at last, you recall the strange footfall at the piano, the mark near the chair? Yes. Someone waited for him to finish, then asked him to play again, not for beauty, but as a signature, to make the world hear it a second time. And the second player? Holmes opened his eyes. That, Watson, is the only person in this tale whose presence has yet to be confirmed, though their shadow hangs over every bar. By the time we returned to Baker Street that night, the rain had begun to fall in slow, deliberate sheets, pooling in the gutters and dimpling the panes of our sitting-room window. Holmes had not spoken a word since we departed the Fielding residence, and I knew better than to interrupt him while he inhabited that peculiar state. Self-absorption, so inwardly focused that even the fire's warmth seemed to reach him only as an abstraction. He lit his pipe once, twice, then let it die between his fingers as he turned toward the cabinet that held his archives. There is something familiar about the name Lena Vogel, he murmured, kneeling to retrieve a file bound in worn twine. Not merely from Mr. Rowe's account, but from a review I once encountered. Yes, here. He extracted a folded clipping from a Parisian music journal, its edges brittle with age. He passed it to me. The article bore the date March 1893. Vienna's winter recital. Meer and Vogel dazzle with dissonant unity. A duet of storm and stillness. Meer's controlled restraint met Vogel's tempestuous improvisations. Yet beneath the harmony there was tension, unspoken and unresolved. Critics murmured of something more than musical friction. Vogel vanished from the public stage not a month later. I looked up. So she disappeared soon after this? Holmes nodded. And has not performed publicly since. Nor, according to Rowe, has she resurfaced among Meer's circles, which begs the question, why reappear now, and why under such ghostly circumstances? At that moment there came a soft rap at the door. Holmes turned with a start, as though roused from sleep. Expecting someone? I asked. No, he replied, rising. Mrs. Hudson opened the door and handed in a small card, pale ivory with neat cursive. Miss C. Vogel requests a moment of your time. She will wait at the Turkish tea room across from the Royal Opera House. Tonight only. Midnight. Holmes turned the card over. No address, no signature, no embellishment. Just the initials and the peculiar hour. She signs herself C. Vogel, I noted aloud. Not Lena? Indeed, Holmes replied. A deliberate obfuscation, or perhaps a relation. Either way, we shall answer the summons. It is not often one receives an invitation from a vanished virtuoso. Though I voiced concern over the late hour and the possibility of deception, Holmes dismissed the worry with a flick of his hand. By 11:30, we were walking through the gas-lit streets of Covent Garden, past hansom cabs splashing through the gutters and lamplighters, finishing their rounds. The Turkish tea room, a slender establishment wedged between a milliner's shop and an antiquarian book dealer, was one of those places known only to night-dwellers and theatre folk, open at odd hours and heavy with the scent of cardamom and burnt sugar. Holmes stepped in ahead of me, scanning the dim interior. A gramophone played faintly in the corner, and a few insomniac patrons sat sipping tea beneath the carved wooden latticework. At the far end, in a corner secluded by velvet drapery, sat a woman dressed in midnight blue, her face partially concealed by a veil of gauze so fine it caught the light like frost on glass. She did not rise, but gestured calmly for us to join. "Her, Mr. Holmes," she said, her accent unmistakably Viennese. "Dr. Watson, I appreciate your discretion." Holmes inclined his head. "Miss Vogel, or is it Miss Vogel's sister?" A faint smile. "Clara Vogel, Lena's cousin, though I have no doubt you already suspected as much." I suspected. Your careful phrasing. Now, Miss Vogel, you summoned us. Let us not waste the night. Clara Vogel took a sip of her tea, then placed the cup down precisely. Her gloved hands trembled ever so slightly. I was close to Felix Meer once. Not in the way the papers gossiped, but genuinely close. I played beside him, travelled with him. He was brilliant. But brilliance comes with shadows, Mr. Holmes. He was not always kind, and he had a habit of binding others to his music, of making promises he had no intention of keeping. "And you believe those broken promises led to his death?" Holmes asked. Clara hesitated. "No, but I believe someone he hurt, someone from our past, has returned. Someone who heard what Felix once denied them and decided to write their own coda." Holmes leaned forward. "You speak poetically, speak plainly." She studied him with eyes far older than her face. "There was a woman, a cellist, Margit Frey. We all studied together in Vienna. She was engaged to Felix for a time, though he treated it as nothing more than a passing infatuation. When he left her, she nearly took her own life, disappeared after a final quarrel. No one saw her again. And you believe she has returned now, after all these years? I asked. Clara gave a small nod. Last week, I received a letter without return address. Inside, a single page from a sonata Felix and Margit had composed together, a private experiment. Only 3 copies ever existed, one with him, one with her, one with me. Mine has never left my home, and yet here it was, smudged with ash, as if pulled from a fire. Holmes's expression grew grave. Why did you not go to the police? Because I have no proof, only a pattern, and because I suspected Felix would dismiss it as he dismissed so many things. He could not see that music written with the heart can cut deeper than words. Holmes sat back. And yet you believe this cellist, Margit, killed him? I believe she confronted him, perhaps only that. But if Felix played that final note, he may have done so under her direction, as penance or farewell. The veiled woman stood then, her cup untouched since the first sip. I have told you what I know, Mr. Holmes. I will not speak of this again. But there is something else. Felix kept a locked box in his conservatory. It was not for sheet music. It was personal. If she left a sign, it will be in there. And with that, she slipped away into the fog, her silhouette swallowed by the streetlight's halo. We sat in silence for a moment before Holmes rose. She is hiding something, Watson. Not only about the past, but about last week. You don't believe her? I believe she told the truth, but not the whole of it. Back at Baker Street, Holmes retrieved a key ring from his drawer and held it up. I picked this from the same desk where the forged corridor key was hidden. There was a smaller brass key nestled beneath a sheaf of music scores. And you believe it opens the box? Holmes merely smiled. We returned to Kensington the following morning under pretense of retrieving an umbrella I had accidentally left behind. Mrs. Glynn, flustered but accommodating, led us again to the conservatory. The box in question sat beneath the piano, small cedar and bound in brass trim. Holmes inserted the key. It clicked open with a sound like the soft snap of a metronome. Inside, a single envelope, a strip of faded blue ribbon, and a pressed flower, edelweiss, brittle and ghostly. Holmes opened the envelope. A single page written in a strong, deliberate hand. You made me promise, Felix, and I did. But promises made in silence echo louder when broken. You said I would never play your final note. Now I have played it twice, once in your arms, once over your grave. Holmes read it again, then folded it carefully. She was here, he said. She confronted him, perhaps more. I swallowed. Then Margit Fry lives and plays still. Holmes turned to me, eyes alight. And if she does, Watson, then someone in London has heard her play. The afternoon sky over London was the colour of pewter and just as heavy. A hush seemed to settle over the rooftops, interrupted only by the occasional carriage wheel sloshing through puddles or the distant toll of church bells. Holmes paced the length of our sitting room in a manner that reminded me of a caged hawk, fingers drumming against the inside of his sleeve, thoughts flying far ahead of his feet. I had just returned from a short walk, bringing with me a copy of the Musical Gazette, and was surprised to find Holmes still in the very same room, in precisely the same coat he had worn on our morning excursion to Kensington. He had not moved to change nor to eat. You are consumed, I remarked, placing the newspaper on the desk. Quite so, Watson, he said, without turning. The smallest errors are the loudest. One need only listen. And what, precisely, has been whispering to you, I asked. Holmes stopped abruptly, eyes fixed on the violin in the corner. The letter in the box was too poetic for a killer, or rather, too theatrical. but not disingenuous. It rang with the timbre of someone steeped in performance. I raised an eyebrow. A performance within a performance. Exactly. Consider, Margit Fry may have visited Mere. She may even have coerced him to play that final bar. But I believe we are hearing two voices, one of memory and one of manipulation. I poured us both a cup of tea and seated myself across from him. You suspect someone is using Miss Frey's past as camouflage. Perhaps, or worse, someone is using music itself as the murder weapon. The notion struck me as outlandish. You think a man can be killed with a melody? Holmes looked at me with his usual mixture of pity and amusement. Not by the melody, Watson. By the message behind it. What if the final note, played twice, was not a slip of the hand, but a signature, a warning, or a claim? Before I could respond, he rose suddenly and snatched the musical gazette from the desk. You purchased this today? Yes. Thought it might contain something useful, or at least distracting. He flipped through the pages with a quick, trained eye and stopped near the center spread. There. A review of last week's chamber performance at Grafton Hall, an obscure ensemble, and yet one name stands out. Miss M. Frey, cello. He tapped the line twice. She has been here, in London, publicly. I leaned forward. But then, why conceal herself from everyone? Why approach Clara in secrecy, leave a letter, disappear into the shadows? Holmes closed the journal softly. Because the woman who performed at Grafton Hall may not be the same woman who stood beside Felix Mere's piano. You think the name was borrowed? Or resurrected, Holmes replied. There is something performative at the center of this mystery, Watson. Identity, artistry, vengeance, all masquerading behind compositions and stage names. Without further delay, we hailed a cab and made for Grafton Hall, an unassuming building tucked away behind Hanover Square, used primarily for student performances and lesser-known recitals. The stone steps were worn smooth from decades of footfall, and the heavy oak doors bore the scuffs of stacked music cases and rosin-stained fingers. A grey-haired attendant met us in the vestibule, peering at us from beneath wire spectacles. Afternoon, sirs. Looking to reserve tickets? Holmes showed him his card. Sherlock Holmes. I'm hoping you might assist me in tracking a recent performer, Miss M. Fry, cellist, listed in your program for the 27th. The man blinked. Oh yes, quiet girl, didn't speak much, Austrian, I think. She performed as part of the Aristea Quartet. Fine playing, mournful, touched a few hearts in the audience. Do you have an address for her, or the quartet? The man furrowed his brow. I might have the booking details in the back office. Wait here. He disappeared behind a red velvet curtain, and Holmes turned to me. If Margit Fry or someone using her name performed here, then we must assume the identity is current. This opens two paths. Either the original Fray has returned, or someone seeks to exploit her legend. Moments later, the man returned with a yellowing ledger. Here we are. The quartet was booked through a Mr. Harold Phipps, manager for the Academy's chamber division. The cellist's name was listed as Margit. Frey's care of Phipps's London address. No further contact information. May I? Holmes asked, and the man handed over the page. Holmes made a swift copy of the address and tipped his hat. You have been most helpful. Come, Watson. The address led us to a modest flat above a tobacconist's shop on Bentinck Street. A woman in a violet shawl answered the door. Mr. Phipps's housekeeper. She informed us that the manager had just left for his afternoon session at the Academy, but would return by 5. Holmes left a note requesting a brief audience, and we withdrew to a nearby cafe to wait. Holmes was unusually quiet as he sipped his coffee. His fingers traced invisible patterns across the table, sketching connections that I could not yet see. "Watson," he said at length, "have you ever considered that the motive behind a murder might not be hate, but homage?" I looked up from my plate. "You think this crime was a tribute or a final duet?" he said softly. At 5:15, we returned to Bentinck Street and found Mr. Harold Phipps at home. He was a wiry man in his 40s, with a clipped manner and a conductor's expressive hands. "Yes," he confirmed when asked. "Margit Fry performed at Grafton. She approached me months ago, sent a letter with a reference from a Vienna conservatoire, spoke excellent English, very reserved, played with unusual depth. I'd no idea she was once renowned. She seemed almost embarrassed by praise." Holmes leaned in. "And this was the real Margit Fry?" Phipps blinked. "I assumed so. She showed me a photograph of her younger self, signed by Mayer, actually. She carried herself like someone returning from grief." "Did she mention him?" "Only once," she said. "He taught me what it meant to end on silence." Then she changed the subject. Holmes tapped his fingers. "When did she leave London?" "She didn't say. After the recital, she vanished. No forwarding address, just gone." Holmes thanked the man, and we returned again to Baker Street. Inside, he stood before the fireplace. Eyes narrowed. "She is not hiding, Watson. She is finishing something. A performance delayed by years, and someone else knows it." I frowned. "Who?" Holmes turned, a new fire in his eyes. "Whoever forged the corridor key, whoever played that final note in Mere's home, we are not chasing a woman. We are chasing a duet." The following morning brought with it a break in the clouds, though not in the tension that had steadily wound itself around our investigation. A pale winter sun streamed through the blinds of our sitting room at Baker Street, illuminating the floating dust and casting long shadows across the carpet. Holmes, however, remained seated in his armchair, fingers steepled and gaze fixed, not on any tangible object but on a point just beyond the reach of the visible world, a signal I had come to recognize as the prelude to one of his mental revolutions. "The put. Question we must now ask," he said without looking at me, "is not simply who killed Felix Mayer, but who orchestrated the death to appear as it did, eerily, artfully, and with an intimacy few could mimic." He rose, still in his dressing gown, and moved to the violin resting beside the bookshelf. He plucked a dissonant chord and let it hang in the air. "There is a signature in every act, Watson, a trace of character even in crime. Our phantom did not merely kill, they composed." "You believe the killer wanted to be recognized?" I asked. "Not necessarily by the public," Holmes said, "but certainly by one person or perhaps one pair of ears." I pondered that cryptic reply as he set the violin aside and reached for his boots. "Where now?" "The Academy of Music," he said. "If Felix Mayer, Clara Vogel, and Margit Fry share a common past, then its echoes must still linger in those halls, and I suspect we shall not walk them alone." Within the hour, we arrived at the Royal Academy of Music, nestled between stately Georgian buildings just off Marylebone Road. The cold had sharpened since morning, and students in long scarves and wool coats darted between entrances, their cases strapped tightly against their backs. Our brass plaque gleamed beside the grand front doors, and from within came the muted tones of a string quartet warming up. We were met in the entrance foyer by the registrar, a grey-bearded man named Mr. Camden, who had been informed of our inquiry by Holmes's earlier telegram. "Yes, Mr. Holmes, we are still reeling from the loss of Mr. Mere," Camden said as he led us through a tiled corridor lined with framed portraits of past faculty. He wasn't formally attached to the academy in recent years, but his master classes were legend, a man of singular talent, and of solitude, Holmes added dryly. Indeed, always kept to himself. That's why I found it rather unusual. Camden stopped short, then shook his head. "But never mind. Please, Mr. Camden," Holmes said gently. "Everything is relevant." The registrar sighed. "Well, some weeks ago, Mr. Mere requested access to the archival library, quite suddenly. Said he needed to retrieve an old composition from the Vienna collection. Odd considering he'd publicly denounced that entire phase of his career. Did he come alone?" I asked. "No. That's the odd part. He came with a woman. I never caught her name, but she signed. The visitor log, Margit F. Slender, well-dressed, face half covered by a lace scarf. The two of them seemed strained. I assumed it was a former pupil." Holmes turned sharply. "The library still holds those logs?" Camden nodded. "Certainly. Follow me." We descended a narrow stair into the belly of the building, where ancient sheet music, journals, and rare compositions were preserved under low lights and careful humidity controls. In a side room that smelled of parchment and lavender oil, Camden retrieved a thick logbook and opened it to a page marked 3 weeks prior. Holmes scanned the line, F. Mere, M. Frey, access to Vienna collection, 2:10 p.m. to 3:25 p.m. He tapped the entry. "And what did they request?" Camden consulted a shelf label. "The original duet manuscripts from the 1893 recital. Only one was still held in our archive. The others, lost or privately held." "And was the manuscript returned?" "Yes, the following day. But the librarian on duty made a note in the margin." He pointed to the side of the page, where a faint pencil remark read, "Slight coffee stain, top margin, bar 1415. Score unaltered otherwise." Holmes smiled thinly. "Unaltered physically, perhaps, but the impression may already have been taken." "Turn to me. Recall Clara Vogel's words. Felix made promises he never intended to keep. I wonder now if one such promise was to destroy the duet entirely. And yet here he was, revisiting it. As we left the archives and walked back into the music corridor, a piercing sound caught our ears. From one of the practice halls came the rising, sorrowful cry of a cello. It was not the tentative scratching of a student, but the bold, deliberate phrasing of a master. Holmes halted, eyes gleaming. "That is not coincidence." He strode toward the door without knocking. Inside stood a tall woman with ash-blonde hair pinned beneath a wide-brimmed hat, playing with her eyes closed. She stopped the moment we entered and did not appear surprised. "Mr. Holmes," she said, her accent unmistakably Austrian. "You have found me at last." "Miss Frey, I presume?" Holmes asked. She nodded, laying the cello gently across a velvet-padded bench. "Yes, though until yesterday I had not used that name in over 20 years. Why now?" she smiled faintly. "Because Felix finally played the note I asked of him, the one he owed. Watson and I exchanged a glance." "You were with him that night?" Holmes asked. "I was," she said. "I came not to kill him, but to ask for acknowledgement. The duet was ours. He performed it under his own name years ago. Claimed it was original. Lied to every critic. Clara tried to defend him once, but he silenced her." She crossed to the window, eyes distant. "I never wanted revenge, only credit. So I told him I would come to London, play it publicly, sign my name beneath his. He asked me to delay the recital, then invited me to his home. He looked older, frightened." Holmes stepped forward. "And he played the sonata?" "Yes. But only once. He asked me to forgive him. I left him seated at the piano. He was alive when I closed the door." "Then who played the second note?" Holmes asked. Softly she turned, frowning. "Second?" Holmes studied her carefully. "The final flourish was played twice that night, once while Mr. Rowe was present. A second time, minutes after he left. Are you saying you did not play it?" Her face paled. No. I was gone. Before 10:15. I walked to Paddington, stayed the night at a boarding house near the station. I have the innkeeper's ledger. Holmes nodded. Then someone else was there, someone who knew you had come, and who intended to frame your echo as murder. The silence that followed was thick with implication. Margaret Fry stepped forward. There was a man, she said slowly. A violinist. We both studied under the same master in Vienna. He was jealous of Felix, of me. His name was Lothar Schell. I hadn't thought of him in years, until last month. I received a parcel containing the very ribbon I used to bind my original score. It was scorched at the edges. Holmes's eyes darkened. A message, or a warning. Margaret nodded. And now Felix is dead, and I am painted as a ghost. Outside the window, the bells of St. Mary's tolled once more. Holmes turned toward the door, his coat already swinging from his shoulders. "Watson," he said grimly, "our next visit shall be to the offices of the Academy's visitor registry. I want every name entered the same day as Margaret Fry's. If Lothar Schell has returned to London, we must find him before he plays his own final note." The day had grown colder by the time we departed the Royal Academy of Music, and the wind over Marylebone Road was no longer playful but bitter, like a sharp rebuke to the warmth of Margaret Fry's confession. She had spoken plainly, with no theatrical embellishment or plea for sympathy. In her every word there was a sense of dignity, tempered not by pride, but by pain that had hardened into restraint. Holmes walked quickly, his gloved hands clasped, behind his back and his collar turned up against the wind. I kept pace beside him, the questions still forming in my mind. "If she did not play the second note," I said, "then we must assume a third party was waiting for her to leave. Someone who had planned the murder to coincide with her visit." "Precisely, Watson," Holmes replied without looking up. "Someone who required the illusion of Margaret's presence even after she had gone, the echo of her artistry as a blade with which to kill, clean, invisible and poetic." We arrived at the side entrance of the Academy, where the visitor registry was maintained. Holmes produced a written note authorizing our access, something he had prearranged earlier that morning, anticipating the very moment we now found ourselves in. The clerk, a lean young man with ink-stained fingers, led us to a narrow office filled with ledgers, dusty catalogues, and the faint scent of aged glue. "Here's the log for the day in question," the clerk said, laying out the volume. "Only a few visitors that afternoon. The reading room is seldom busy on Tuesdays." Holmes leaned over the book, running a gloved finger down the page. The names were written in neat cursive, one after the other. 2:10 p.m. Felix Meir, Margaret Fry, Vienna Collection, 2:30 p.m. Leonard Parr, Counterpoint. Studies, 2:45 p.m. E. Heathcote, Choral Manuscripts, 3:10 p.m. L. Schell, Archival Index, Composer Dossier. "There," Holmes said softly, tapping the final. "Name." "He was here, L. Schell." "Could be coincidence," I offered. "Perhaps it's not the same man." Holmes shook his head. "Not in this tale, Watson. The coincidence is too precise. He arrived minutes after Meir and Fry, likely waited until they had left, and if he accessed composer dossiers, he would have had full view of the historical records, including their shared performance history." Holmes turned to the clerk. "Do you know if Mr. Schell is a current student?" The young man frowned. "No, sir, he was listed as a guest, signed the ledger with a visiting scholar's pass. That means he submitted documentation to our bursary office." "May we see it?" Holmes asked. Within minutes we were handed a slim folder marked Schell Lothar. Inside was a single sheet, a visiting request signed in an angular German hand, along with a letter of introduction purportedly from the Conservatory of Salzburg. The paper bore the correct watermark, the dates plausible, but Holmes's gaze lingered on the ink. "Forged," he said after a moment. "Impeccably so, but nonetheless false. This was written with a Müller fountain pen, too modern for the institution's correspondence style. The real conservatory writes on slate-pressed linen parchment." The clerk, now thoroughly unnerved, asked, "Should I notify the head archivist?" "No," Holmes said. "This is now a criminal matter. Notify Scotland Yard. Tell them Sherlock. Holmes is investigating the assumed identity of Lothar Schell in connection with the death of Felix Meyer." Once outside again, Holmes seemed newly invigorated. "We must learn where he resides, Watson. But he has hidden himself well, which means we shall not find him by walking forward. We must go backward, through those who would know his music. You think he's still performing?" "Not performing," Holmes replied. "Listening and watching." He raised his hand to hail a cab. "To Clerkenwell. There is a man there, Basil Morland, once a violin maker to the aristocracy, now a purveyor of second-hand bows and broken dreams. If Lothar Schell has returned to London, he may have sought a familiar companion, an instrument worthy of his vengeance." The streets grew narrower and dirtier as we entered Clerkenwell. The fog had crept low to the ground, cloaking boot heels and blurring windows. At last we came to a crooked little shop with a cracked sign above the door, "Morland's Strings and Repair." Inside, the air smelled of rosine, oil, and time itself. Rows of violins hung like sleeping bats from the ceiling beams, and cello cases leaned in mismatched pairs along the walls. From behind the counter emerged an elderly man with white hair like wild grass and spectacles that magnified his watery eyes. "Mr. Morland," Holmes said, "I am seeking information on a recent client. German accent, mid-40s, perhaps older, likely intense, private. May have asked after historical models, Steiner or Lupote, perhaps." The old man squinted. "I came in last week, very precise. Asked if I had a bow with ivory tips. Said the tone mattered for purity of attack. Only real musicians care about that sort of thing. Said his name was Leonhardt. Or Leon. Not Lothar. Wrote it down, though." He shuffled behind the counter and pulled out a small receipt book. "Here we are. L. Schwartz, paid in coin. Took a late-period Colin Mézin violin, very fine instrument, French varnish, and a silver-mounted bow, left no address." Holmes examined the entry. "Schwartz, another mask, but it confirms our man is here, and playing." "Did he mention where he might perform?" "No," Morland said. "But he asked if there were rehearsal halls open late at night. Mentioned needing solitude. I sent him to Chapel Court, a run-down set of practice rooms behind the old theatre district. No one goes there now except buskers and ghosts." Holmes gave a thin smile. "We shall take our chances with both." Chapel Court was exactly as Morland had described, narrow, dark, and damp. The rehearsal rooms stood in a row, boarded up save for one where a faint light burned. Holmes motioned for silence and moved to the cracked window. We peered in. There, standing beneath a single gas lamp, was a man dressed in black, his back to us. A violin rested on his shoulder. He played softly, slowly. And as the melody rose, a twisting, mournful theme, I saw Holmes's expression change. "The missing duet," he whispered. "But reversed. He's playing it backward." "What? Does it mean—" "It means," Holmes murmured, "that he has no intention of letting this music end." Just then the violinist turned. His face was sharp, aged prematurely by bitterness. He saw us, and he ran. Holmes moved like lightning. After him, we chased the figure down Chapel Court, boots echoing across cobblestones. He turned down an alley, vaulting a low fence, but age had worn his strength. We caught him near the river's edge, breathless and cornered, his violin case still strapped to his back. Holmes approached slowly. "Lothar Schell," he said. "The music stopped long ago. You're playing into silence." Schell looked up, eyes wild. "No," he hissed. "I've only just begun the second movement." Lothar Schell stood panting. At the edge of the riverbank, the flickering lamplight glinting off the silver fittings of the violin case still strapped to his back. The fog that rolled up from the Thames coiled around him like a living thing, as if London itself were hesitant to decide whether this man was the hunter or the hunted. Holmes remained a careful 3 paces away, arms at his sides, gaze fixed not on Schell's eyes, but on his fingers, trembling, twitching, still infused with the ghost of his performance. I stood just behind Holmes, heart still hammering from the pursuit. The alley behind us was deserted, the street sounds muffled by distance and mist. "Mr. Schell," Holmes said at last, his tone precise and almost unnervingly calm, "there is no orchestra here, no gallery to impress. The only audience left is the one who understands you, and will not be moved by drama." Schell's breath came in shallow bursts. His eyes, pale grey, darted from Holmes to me and back again. When he spoke, his voice was low but taut, with something sharp and coiled. "Beneath it, you think this is about Felix?" "I think," Holmes said slowly, "this is about recognition, about a wrong long buried beneath applause that was not meant for you. And now you have decided to compose your own ending, an encore of vengeance." Schell laughed, bitter and hollow. "He took what was mine. For years I watched his name rise while mine fell into footnotes. Do you know what it is to hear your music echoed by someone who refuses to name you, to be erased one measure at a time? You collaborated on the original duet. He called it a technical experiment," Schell spat. "Said it lacked narrative cohesion, and yet 2 years later he played it, our piece with Margit, renamed it, claimed it entirely as his, not a single credit. And you never confronted him." "I did," Schell said, stepping forward now, gesturing with both hands. "Once, in 1895, he dismissed me as a bitter student, said if I wanted acknowledgement I should compose something better. I swore then, if he would not give me my name, I would give him a silence to carry forever." Holmes's face was unreadable, but I could see in his eyes that a shape was forming, a structure of understanding. "You re-entered London under false documentation," Holmes said. "You used an alias to access the Academy's records, to track Margit's reappearance. You waited for her and Mia to reconnect. You even forged a copy of her original ribbon and mailed it to Clara. Why?" "To force the shadows to step into light," Schell said. "I knew she would come. Knew she'd want closure. And I knew Felix would not be able to resist offering her a staged repentance, but his guilt would not allow him to survive it." "You're saying you didn't kill him?" Schell's voice hardened. "I played the second note. Yes. I waited in the shadows. I entered through the corridor after Margit left. He was still, sitting at the piano, alive, but broken. I said nothing, just played. The final flourish, his flourish. He turned, looked at me, and then he simply died." We were silent. "He collapsed," Schell continued. "Right there, I didn't touch him, I never raised a hand. He fell forward like a puppet cut from its strings. I checked his pulse. Gone." "And yet," Holmes said, voice quiet but cutting, "you left behind the corridor key. A foolish—" "Oversight?" Schell blinked. "No, that wasn't mine." Holmes looked sharply at him. "Then whose was it?" "I entered using my own forged copy. I kept it. It's here." He reached carefully into the inner pocket of his coat, pulling out a narrow brass key on a short chain. Holmes took it, examined it, and nodded. "Then the other key," I said slowly. the one found hidden in the drawer. Belonged to someone else, Holmes finished. Someone who had also been in that room. Shell stepped back. What are you saying? That Felix Mayer may have had a third visitor that night, and the timing of your arrival allowed them to slip away undetected. But the door— Holmes raised a hand. You entered through the corridor, but someone could have exited through the garden. Remember, Rowe heard the final note as he crossed the mews, a precise window of 10 to 12 minutes, plenty of time for a second departure. I could feel my blood run cold. Then Mayer may not have died naturally at all. Holmes turned to me. Precisely. We assumed that the echo of the final bar, played a second time, was a signature of guilt, but it may have been a witness's lament, or worse, a frame. Shell staggered backward and leaned against the lamppost, his energy suddenly drained. I didn't kill him, he said again, softer this time, but I wanted him to feel it, the way I had, forgotten, erased. Holmes nodded once, almost sadly. You may not have laid hands upon him, Mr. Shell, but your presence cast the final shadow on his heart. We turned him over to Lestrade shortly thereafter. Though there was no conclusive evidence to charge him with murder, the Yard held him under suspicion for unlawful entry, falsifying documents, and trespass. Lestrade grumbled, of course, about the vagueness of motive and the absence of poison or violence, but he was wise enough not to ignore Holmes's cautions. Back in our sitting room that evening, the fire had been lit and the kettle sang cheerfully. On the hob, Holmes sat once more with his violin, though he did not play. Instead, he stared into the flames, the expression on his face unreadable even to me. We are missing something, he said at last. You believe Shell was telling the truth? I do. And not merely because of his confession, but because of its silences. The man had no fear of being found. He returned to public performance. He played the duet at Chapel Court, as if daring someone to hear. A killer does not seek an audience, a composer does. Then who killed Mayer? I asked. Holmes leaned back. It must be someone close enough to know the timing of Margit's visit, someone with access to the garden, someone who would benefit from Mayer's death. He turned toward me then, his gaze clear and sharp once more. Watson, we must speak with Clement Rowe again. The accompanist? Yes, the only man who claims to have heard the final note. You think he's lying? Holmes rose. I think he told the truth about hearing the note, but not about where he heard it from, or when. I stared at him. You mean— Yes, Holmes said grimly. Clement Rowe may have never left the property at all. By the following morning, the soft drizzle that had blanketed the city seemed to sharpen into a purposeful rain, as if even the weather had conspired to wash away any lingering traces of the truth. Holmes, however, was not to be swayed by fog, or drizzle, or the lies that hung about this case like a shroud of mist. We sat in our Baker Street sitting room, he at the table examining his notes by the dim light of a shaded lamp, and I opposite, a cup of untouched tea cooling in my hands. Holmes had said little since our return from Chapel Court, but I had grown accustomed to the silence that marked his deepest deductions. At last he straightened, tapped his pencil once against his notepad, and turned to me. Watson, there is a rhythm to falsehood, like a metronome slightly askew. You may not hear it at first, but once attuned to its tempo it becomes unbearable. I waited, knowing this preamble was the overture to something decisive. Our Mr. Clement Rowe, Holmes continued, is too clean, his grief too well balanced, his concern too precise. He told us he heard the second playing of the final bar while crossing the mews at 10:15. But what if the timing is incorrect or deliberately altered? I frowned. He seemed sincere. Indeed. But sincerity in manner is not truth in substance. Consider, Rowe claimed to have exited the house shortly after 10, via the rear garden gate. He heard the note from outside. Yet the garden corridor was supposedly locked. He did not have a key. Felix kept it on his person. Which raises the question, I said slowly. How could Rowe have returned or remained inside if the only connection between house and conservatory was locked from both sides? Holmes smiled. Exactly, Watson. He rose and rang for Mrs. Hudson. When she entered, he passed her a brief note. Please see that this is delivered to Mr. Clement Rowe at the Royal Academy. I have no doubt he will call on us within the hour. Mrs. Hudson took the note with a look of unspoken curiosity and withdrew. Holmes turned to me. We must be delicate. If Rowe is innocent, our suspicions must not drive him away. If he is guilty, then we must see whether the mask slips. And indeed it was not 45 minutes later that Clement Rowe arrived, his umbrella dripping in the hallway, and his expression one of carefully controlled anxiety. Mr. Holmes, you summoned me. Holmes gestured for him to sit, and Rowe took the seat by the hearth. There has been a development, Holmes said, a most intriguing one. A man named Lothar Schell has surfaced, a former colleague of both Felix Mayer and Margit Fry. You are familiar with the name? Rowe's brow furrowed. No, I can't say I am. Was he a suspect? Holmes gave a tight smile. He claims he entered the conservatory after Miss Fry departed, found Felix still alive, and played the final bar himself. Yet he insists Mayer was dead before he fled. Rowe looked shocked. So I truly did hear it from the Muse. Holmes tilted his head. You're certain of your position at that time? Of course, Rowe said. I had just stepped through the garden gate. The air was damp. I remember because the cobblestones were slippery. And the note you heard, it was the same flourish Mayer had played before. Yes, Rowe said. Identical, that's what unsettled me. Holmes folded his hands. Then, Mr. Rowe, perhaps you will indulge me in a brief demonstration. He stood and retrieved a sketched floor plan of the Mayer residence from his folio and laid it on the table before Rowe. Would you kindly indicate your precise position when you heard the second flourish? Rowe leaned over and tapped the drawing near the rear gate. Here. I had just stepped onto the footpath. Holmes gave no reaction. And how long would you say it took to reach that point from the conservatory door? Rowe paused. No more than 20 seconds. Perhaps less. Holmes smiled. Interesting. Because when Watson and I timed that very walk 2 days ago, it required a minimum of 40 seconds, given the narrow path, the hedgerows, and the gravel underfoot. Rowe said nothing. Holmes continued, his voice gentle but sharp. In truth, Mr. Rowe, I do not believe you ever left the garden. I believe you waited in the shadows. I believe you heard not the echo of a second performance, but the original, and that the second flourish, which you claimed to hear later, was your own. Rowe stood abruptly, his composure cracking. That's preposterous, is it? Holmes said, rising. You knew Margit was coming. You knew Felix intended to reopen the old composition, and you knew, above all else, that when he played that duet again, it would no longer be yours to share. I stared at Rowe, stunned. But I thought he merely accompanied Mayer. Holmes nodded to me. Indeed, Watson, but in music, as in murder, accompaniment is everything. Felix Mayer's genius lay not only in his compositions, but in his partnerships. Rowe's career was tied to Mayer's shadow, and now that shadow was about to be eclipsed, first by the return of Frey, then by the whispers of the past. If Mayer were to give credit to anyone else, Rowe's position would be diminished, perhaps even erased. Rowe's jaw tightened. You have no proof. No. Holmes crossed the room and retrieved a slim parcel wrapped in paper. This was found beneath the conservatory bench, tucked under a panel that slides, a place even the housekeeper didn't know existed. He unwrapped the package. Inside was a small leather-bound notebook. Holmes flipped it open. It is your own, your initials, your handwriting. In it a diary of rehearsal notes, key signatures, annotated bars of the duet. You revised it with Mir in secret, didn't you? Tried to make it yours again. But when Felix chose to revisit the original, Margit's version, you knew he was turning away from you. Rose slumped in the chair. His hands, those careful accompanist's hands, now trembled like leaves in a gale. He told me it was nothing, he said at last, that the past was the past. But I saw the look in his eyes when he spoke of her. She was the ghost he couldn't let go. Holmes watched him with quiet intensity. So you waited until she left, then you returned, played the flourish, your flourish, and you meant it as a requiem, didn't you? Rose's voice was hoarse. I didn't touch him, I swear. He collapsed. I thought he was faking. For effect, you know how he was. Always the dramatist, but when I stepped closer, he was gone. And yet you did not call for help, I said. I panicked, hid the notebook, fled. Holmes gave a slow nod. Then the law will decide the degree of your guilt. But in the court of music, Mr. Rowe, your silence played louder than any crescendo. Lestrade, summoned shortly thereafter, received Rowe with the wary satisfaction of a man whose world had become briefly intelligible. Charges were brought not for murder, but obstruction of justice, unlawful concealment, and attempted deception of a police inquiry. As the evening settled and we sat once more in the soft glow of our Baker Street fire, Holmes reached for his violin. He plucked a few discordant strings, adjusted the tuning, then began to play a soft, melancholic tune. The strange thing, Watson, he said without looking up, is that in the end, none of them killed Mayer by their own hand. Not Margit, not Shell, not even Rowe. It was the weight of unresolved music that crushed him. And yet, I replied, each of them played a part. Holmes smiled sadly. Yes, a quartet in silence, each note a secret, each bar a betrayal. The melody faded. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. Though Clement Rowe had been taken into custody by Scotland Yard, and his confession had clarified much, Holmes remained uncharacteristically unsettled. It was not, I think, that the solution had been unsatisfying. It had in truth provided a masterful alignment of motive and means, but rather that something still rang discordant to Holmes's inner ear, like a fugue with a note subtly off-key. He sat by the fire that evening with his violin untouched in his lap, the bow resting still against the strings. He neither played nor paced, but stared into the orange glow, the shadows flickering against his sharp profile. I finally broke the silence. You believe Rowe was telling the truth, that he did not kill Felix Mir? Holmes did not look up. Yes, and yet he stood, gently placed the violin aside, and moved to the table where a sheaf of papers lay beneath a glass weight. Among them were Felix Mir's final compositions, the ones recovered from his study, his conservatory, and his private desk. Holmes began to sort them again, as if he had already done so 100 times, but hoped this time the ink would speak with greater clarity. You see, Watson, he said at last, what troubles me is not the playing of the final note, nor the panic that followed. What troubles me is the manuscript itself, the composition that Felix Mir played that night. Everyone spoke of it. Clara, Rowe, Margit, Shell. A piece from the past, long believed, forgotten. But no two accounts agree on its final bars. I furrowed my brow. Surely such a thing could be chalked up to memory, could it not? In ordinary circumstances, yes, Holmes said, but not in music. Musicians, especially those of Mir's stature, recall every measure with the precision of a watchmaker. And yet Clara Vogel described the last page as a lament. Margit Fry said it ended in silence. Shell claimed Mayer never let the final coda survive. Rowe believed it finished in triumph, and the version we recovered from the piano, he held up the page, is incomplete. He handed me the manuscript. The last few bars were missing, ripped cleanly from the edge. A torn margin remained, jagged and unmistakably recent. Holmes's voice dropped. Someone took the last measure. But why? I asked. He moved to the window, pulling back the curtain and peering out into the rain-streaked streets of Baker Street. Because that final measure held something no one else was meant to see, or perhaps something everyone feared might reveal to them. I rose from my chair and joined him. You believe Mere altered the composition? Not altered. Annotated, Holmes said, and not merely in notation. I believe Felix embedded a message in that final bar, words disguised in musical form, a signature, a final truth, and someone removed it after his death to ensure it would never be read. Could it have been Rowe? Holmes shook his head. He fled in haste, hid only the rehearsal notebook. The manuscript on the stand was left in full view, and yet now the last page is missing. Then someone returned after Rowe, or, I paused, someone never left. Holmes nodded. We must go back. Back to Mere's house? Not quite. First, to the Royal Academy. There is someone. We must speak to someone who handled the page before any of us, the librarian. It was already past 9 o'clock when we arrived at the Academy, but Holmes's name and reputation opened more doors than any master key. The night steward let us in and guided us through the empty corridors to a small book-lined chamber that smelled of vellum, dust, and tea leaves. Inside, a young man with round glasses and a pale complexion sat cataloguing old folios. He looked up in surprise as we entered. You are Mr. Giles? Holmes asked. Yes, he said, standing. Assistant librarian. How may I help you? Holmes showed him the torn manuscript. This was retrieved from Felix Mere's conservatory after his death. Before that, do you recall Mr. Mere and Miss Frey visiting the archive? Giles brightened. Yes, I brought them the Vienna duet files. They requested the 1893 program and the handwritten drafts. Did either of them make copies? Giles hesitated. Miss Frey made some notes. She asked for the score to be placed under the window light, claimed she could read better there, but she never copied the final bars. In fact, she stopped at bar 127 and left the room abruptly. Mr. Mere remained behind for another few minutes. Holmes leaned in. And did anyone else enter the archive during that time? The young man nodded. Yes, a Mr. Clement Rowe came in, very briefly, said he was looking for Felix, but when he saw Miss Frey had left, he seemed surprised. He didn't stay, and after Mr. Mere left, no one until I returned to close the room, but I did find something. He rummaged through a drawer and produced a small folded sheet. It was left in the window seat. I meant to return it, but there was no signature. Thought it was a stray. Holmes took the sheet and opened it. It was a draft, clearly written, in Mere's hand. 4 bars of music, yet unlike the rest of the duet. These were in a different key, a modulation that resolved to a sudden, unexpected chord. Beneath the final measure, written in faint pencil, were the words, "This is where the silence must begin." "Forgive me, LL," I breathed. "For Lothar?" Or Holmes said, "For Lena, or both." He turned to Giles. "You may have just handed me the final thread." We returned to Baker Street in silence. Once there, Holmes placed the draft on the mantelpiece and stared at it, as if expecting it to play itself aloud. At last he spoke. "Watson, what if the note Rowe heard, what if the entire flourish was not a flourish at all, but a message, a confession from Mere?" Yes. He knew Margit would visit. He knew Rowe would grow jealous. And he feared Lothar's reappearance. I believe Felix composed those final bars to contain a truth, encoded in harmony, not to vindicate himself, but to ask forgiveness from those he had wronged. And someone feared what that bar might reveal? Precisely. That someone returned to the conservatory after everyone had gone, perhaps even before the police arrived, and tore the measure away. Then who? Holmes's eyes turned toward the fire. There is one name, he said, we have not yet truly considered. Clara Vogel. I stared. But she warned us, gave us direction. Holmes nodded. Exactly. She presented herself not as a player, but as a witness. But consider her placement. Cousin to Lena, friend to Mir, keeper of the ribbon, holder of one of the original duet manuscripts. She inserted herself at every crucial point, just far enough to remain innocent. So you think she was there that night? Holmes turned slowly. I think she never left. A knock came at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered. A letter for you, Mr. Holmes. No sender. Holmes opened it and read aloud. You are closer than you know. But the silence you seek belongs to more than one soul. Meet me where the first echo was heard, tonight, alone. He folded the letter and looked up. Watson, prepare your coat. Where are we going? Holmes's eyes darkened. To the conservatory. One final note remains to be played. The city had once again fallen under a curtain of silence when we stepped out into the street. It was a silence not born of sleep, but of breath held in anticipation, as if London itself waited to hear how this long unfolding melody would end. Holmes moved with a quiet intensity, the letter still folded neatly in his breast pocket. The gaslights blurred in the mist, their yellow halos wavering like stage footlights before a performance. We took a hansom cab to Kensington. Neither of us spoke during the ride. Holmes, his hat pulled low, sat forward slightly as though measuring. The night in moments rather than miles. When we arrived outside Felix Mere's townhouse, I noted the gate had been left ajar. Strange, given that the property was now ostensibly locked and under periodic police observation. Holmes stepped out, first, and signalled for silence with a single raised finger. We passed through the garden gate, the gravel crunching faintly underfoot, and made our way around the side path. Ahead, the glass-panelled conservatory glowed with a pale golden light from within. The scene was almost eerily unchanged since we had last stood there. The grand piano under the glass dome, the lone velvet chair, the music stand still upright. But this time, something had returned to the room, something vital and volatile. Inside, seated where Mere had once sat, was a figure. Draped in dark blue, Clara Vogel. She was not veiled this time. Her face, though aged, bore an elegance that had long since learned to wear grief like a shawl. In her gloved hands, resting on her lap, was the torn final measure of the sonata. Holmes entered first. I followed, careful not to disturb the floorboards. You came, she said softly. I do not enjoy being manipulated, Holmes said evenly, but I do respect a well-timed finale. Clara looked up, eyes shining but calm. Then allow me to speak before the curtain falls. Holmes nodded. She stood slowly and walked to the piano. Her fingers hovered over the keys, but she did not play. I was there that night, she began. I had followed Margit, though she did not know it. I waited outside in the garden behind the hedge. I had no intention of interfering, not at first. But when she left, I saw him standing by the piano, smiling, as if some deep weight had been lifted. He had no right to feel that. Because of Lena, Holmes asked. Clara nodded. She was the one Felix truly betrayed, more than Margit, more than Roe. Lena wrote the opening bars of that sonata when she was only 17. He swore he'd preserve them, that no one would ever play it without her. And yet, Her voice faltered. "He gave it to Margit," I said quietly. "He gave it to everyone but her," Clara snapped. "Lena fled Vienna not because she was scorned, but because she had been erased. After the recital, her name was left out of the program entirely. It broke her. She died not long after. Pneumonia, they said. But I knew it was the silence that killed her." Holmes stepped forward, but gently. "So you returned to London, not just to deliver warnings, but to watch." "I came to see if he would keep his promise," she said. "When I learned Margit was to meet him again, I had to be sure. You entered the conservatory after everyone had left." Clara gave a slight nod. "I had a copy of the corridor key. Lena had kept it all those years tucked into a hollow book. I brought it with me." "And Felix was already dead?" She looked away. "No, he was alive, standing at the piano. He looked at me. He wasn't surprised. I think he had known I would come. He said nothing but sat and gestured for me to listen." She turned toward the keys, her fingers brushing against them now. He played the last bar, the one he had written for Lena. Not Margit's version, not Rose, her bar. It was beautiful, gentle, like the sound of snow falling. "And then?" Holmes asked. Then he stood, stepped forward. I thought he would speak, but he stumbled, clutched his chest and fell. She sank into the chair. I knelt beside him. His eyes were open, but there was no breath, no pulse. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just sat beside him, for I don't know how long. Then I saw the page. His draft. It was tucked under the stand. It bore her name, Lena's, in the title. "You tore it away." "I tore the title away," she whispered. "Not the music. That I left, but the name, and I wanted to keep it, just for her." Holmes turned slowly toward the fire grate beside the piano. "And yet, you left behind another page, one we found later, bearing the message, 'Forgive me, L. Clara.'" Nodded. "It was written beneath the notes. I hadn't seen it until I got home. When I read it, I knew it wasn't for me. It was for her. And in that moment, I realized he had remembered, truly, that he had meant to honor her all along. And so I said gently, 'You arranged this meeting, this confession.'" Clara turned to me. "I didn't kill Felix Mere, but I couldn't let his final act be consumed by scandal and rivalry. I wanted someone to understand, someone to hear the truth as Lena never could." Holmes stepped forward and extended his hand. "May I?" She handed him the torn measure. He examined it, then carefully unfolded it and laid it on the music stand. There it was, the closing coda of a life lived in dissonance, a haunting cadence that resolved not with flourish, but with stillness. Beneath it, faintly, the scrawled initials. L.V. Holmes turned to Clara. "You have told us the truth, and you have preserved the one part of this tale worth remembering." She stood slowly. "What happens now?" Holmes looked at her with unusual gentleness. "You will return to your rooms. Scotland Yard need not hear of this visit. There has been enough grief, enough silence." She paused at the door. "Will you tell them?" Holmes shook his head. "They already believe the tale ended with Roe. Let it end there. The rest belongs to the music." And with that, Clara Vogel stepped once more into the London mist. We remained in the conservatory for some time. Holmes sat at the piano, and for the first time in all our years together, played, not for demonstration, not for irony, but for understanding. He played the final bars as written, slowly, reverently. And when the last note faded into the glass dome above us, the silence that followed was no longer hollow. It was complete. Only then did Holmes speak. "Watson," he said, rising, "there are some crimes the law cannot weigh, and some confessions too delicate for paper. You believe justice was done? Holmes turned to the bench. "No," he said, but harmony was restored. The wind shifted outside, brushing against the glass panes like the ghost of applause, and somewhere in the night a note long buried found its echo. For all that had transpired, ghosts of past compositions, rivalries cast in the language of sonatas, griefs encased in silence, there was a curious stillness to the day that followed. London, in its own bustling indifference, continued to breathe its usual rhythms. The fog lifted somewhat. Streetcars rang their bells through intersections. A brass band played a march outside the Guildhall, unaware of the funeral dirge that had played in the soul of a man whose death no one yet knew how to classify. Back at Baker Street, Holmes sat at his writing desk, reviewing a letter from Scotland Yard. The charges against Clement Rowe had been formally reduced to obstruction and trespass. Inspector Lestrade, in his usual clipped fashion, had written, "No evidence of foul play. Mere likely suffered a stress-induced cardiac event. Case concluded." Curious fellow, your Rowe. Very nearly made a murderer out of himself without ever... Raising a hand, Holmes smirked faintly and set the letter aside. "So," I said, setting down the teapot between us, "no official murder, no warrant. And yet we know in the quietest corners of that story there were hands at work shaping a man's fall." Holmes nodded, not in triumph, but in acknowledgement. "Yes, the world will not remember the details of this case, nor should it. To public. Few, Felix Mayer died of strain and heartbreak. Perhaps in some abstract way he did." I watched him lean back in his chair, eyes half-lidded but sharp beneath the surface. He had not played his violin since the night in the conservatory. Nor had he touched the newspaper. Instead, he spent the morning sorting and restoring the torn manuscript pages recovered from the Mayer estate. Pages that no longer held legal significance, but still carried a kind of spiritual weight for him. "I find it remarkable," I said, "how every person involved believed themselves a victim." "As they were," Holmes murmured. "Victims of love, ambition, betrayal, legacy, none of which are criminal in isolation. But when combined, they crescendo." "And yet only one man died," I said. Holmes gave a dry smile, "and 3 others nearly let themselves be buried with him." A knock interrupted our thoughts. Mrs. Hudson entered with a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. She placed it on the table. "Delivered by hand, sir, no return address, said it was for Mr. Holmes." Holmes nodded, thanked her, and unwrapped the parcel carefully. Inside lay a single phonograph cylinder. No note, no markings, just the cold, metal sheen of a sound waiting to speak. Holmes held it between his fingers like a relic. "Watson, would you be so kind as to fetch the Edison cylinder player?" With the device prepared, Holmes inserted the cylinder, adjusted the stylus, and turned the crank. A hiss of static emerged. Then music, not performed in concert, not staged for an audience. This was private playing. Intimate. The tone wavered. Slightly. But it was unmistakably the same melody we had heard sketched in Felix Mayer's final manuscript. But there was something else. A voice, faint, recorded as though from a great distance, but steady and articulate. It was Mayer himself. "This is for the ones I fail to acknowledge, for Lena, who wrote the first measure, for Margit, who carried the theme, for Lothar, whose hand shaped the rhythm, and for Rowe, who tried so hard to remain in tune. I give this to silence now, not to escape guilt, but to end the dissonance. If you're hearing this, then I am gone, and I hope, somewhere, harmony remains." The cylinder clicked to an end. I sat frozen. Holmes stood, moving to the window, hands clasped. Behind his back. "He knew," he said at last. "He felt the storm gathering. Perhaps not from one person, but from all. He saw that the music was no longer his, and that the echoes were returning to collect their due. He recorded a confession. No, Holmes corrected. He recorded a coda. He turned back to me, and there was something almost wistful in his eyes. Do you understand now, Watson, why I said this was not a case of murder, but of unfinished music? Everyone involved believed themselves to be the original author of the sonata. But Felix understood something they did not, that the truth is not owned, it is shared, and sometimes shared too late. A soft knock came again. Mrs. Hudson returned, this time with an envelope. Another delivery, sir. Holmes took it. The paper was fine vellum, the kind used only by concert halls and high society. He opened it. An invitation to a private recital, in memory of Felix Mere, to be held at Grafton Hall Saturday at 7 p.m. One night only. The Lost Sonata, performed in full. Arrangement restored from original fragments. Performer. Miss M. Frey. Holmes handed it to me. She's completing it, I said. The real ending. He nodded. And she has every right to. The next evening we attended. Grafton Hall was dimly lit, intimate, the kind of venue that heard more truth than grandeur. No fanfare, no program notes. Just Margaret Fry seated at the piano, her posture straight, her face pale but composed. And then she played. The melody that emerged was not the same as what we had heard in fragments. It was fuller now, smoother. The themes reconciled, the transitions no longer abrupt but graceful, and the final bar, long believed lost, resolved not in darkness or despair but in something like forgiveness. The audience sat breathless for a moment after the last note faded. Then silence. Then applause. But Holmes did not clap. He sat still, eyes closed, the music still unfolding in some private space only he could hear. When we returned to Baker Street, he said only one thing before retiring. Watson, there are truths only music dares speak aloud. Tonight we heard one, and in the hush that followed, I understood that even Sherlock Holmes, rationalist, cynic, man of science and syllogism, had made room in his ledger for the unquantifiable, for harmony, for grace, for the silence that comes after, not as an absence, but as completion. In the days that followed Margaret Fry's recital at Grafton Hall, London resumed its regular symphony, one not composed of piano keys and cello strings, but of carriage wheels, shop shutters, and the gaslight murmurs of lives overlapping through misted lanes. Yet something had shifted beneath the ordinary, at least in our small corner of Baker Street. I found Holmes more contemplative than usual, not idle, never idle, but possessed of a quietness that was neither brooding nor distracted. He no longer rifled impatiently through the post, nor interrupted breakfast with unsolicited deductions about the habits of neighboring tenants. Instead, he would sit for long periods at the writing desk, turning pages of Mere's surviving compositions, sketching harmonic structures in the margins, or reading aloud snatches of Goethe, Rilke, or even Heine, all poets who understood the weight of a silence between words. It was a different kind of aftermath, and I knew better than to disturb it. Prematurely. One morning I came downstairs to find Holmes seated with the newspaper, folded neatly on the table. Beside it lay a letter, opened and resting beneath the paperweight shaped like a lyre. He looked up and gestured for me to read. Dear Mr. Holmes, I wish to thank you, not for your discretion, which I always expected, but for your restraint. You could have dismantled my name, dragged my actions into the cold court of logic and consequence, but instead you listened. You allowed a woman to speak without fear of verdict. Felix's music has now been played as it was meant to be, not as an apology nor as an accusation, but as a farewell. I believe he intended it that way all along, even if he lacked the courage to say so. My train departs for Salzburg tomorrow. I do not know whether I shall return. But should our paths ever cross again, know that you gave more than clarity to this case. You gave it peace. Clara, I looked up, unsure what to say. Holmes poured a second cup of tea and handed it to me. You see, Watson, there are some investigations that do not ask for verdicts, only recognition. You mean justice was never the goal? Holmes leaned back. Justice in the traditional sense is a blade, sharp, final. But in this case there were too many hands on the hilt. Margit wanted truth. Lothar wanted memory. Roe wanted place. Clara wanted dignity for the dead. And Felix, I think he just wanted silence to mean something. I sipped the tea slowly. It's rare you allow someone to go unpunished. And rarer still, Holmes replied, that I believe it is right to do so. We spoke little that morning. I returned to my notes, attempting to summarize the complexities of the case into a narrative that would neither betray its depth nor burden the reader with excess. But it was no ordinary case. There had been no murder weapon, no locked room, no telltale mud on the shoes, or a dog that failed to bark. Only people, and music, and wounds left open too long. By early afternoon, Holmes rose and reached for his coat. I am going to the academy, he said. There is one matter I wish to settle before the curtain closes. I offered to accompany him, but he waved me off gently. No, Watson. This visit requires solitude. I must hear something. Alone. He returned that evening well after dark. He carried nothing with him, not even his gloves, and said little beyond a quiet, "Good evening." He went straight to his violin. What he played that night was not one of his usual Baroque improvisations, nor the mathematical etudes he sometimes worked through for mental clarity. It was something slower, more haunting. The final movement of Meer's sonata as restored by Margit. I recognized it immediately, and Holmes played it as if it had lived in his fingers long before it ever reached his ears. When he finished, he rested the bow lightly on the strings and did not move for some time. Finally he said, "I found her name." Clara's, he shook his head. Lena's, written in the margins of an archival draft. Meer had written it in ink, not pencil, then scratched it out, and beneath it, written in the faintest hand, one line, "Not forgotten. Never performed without her." I exhaled. So he meant to honor her? Yes, Holmes said, but too late. That silence hung between us again, the same silence that had trailed behind every scene of this strange elegiac mystery. Not a silence of ignorance or indecision, but one born of recognition. The knowledge that some wounds are not to be healed, but witnessed. The next day, the Academy formally archived the completed manuscript as Sonata for Four Names, with all four original contributors finally acknowledged. I would learn weeks later that the restored piece began to attract attention in certain musical circles abroad, and a copy would be requested by the conservatoire in Vienna. Margit Fry, I am told, continued to perform, but never again played the piece in public. It was meant to be said once, she had told a reporter, like a final word. Clement Rowe, though disgraced in academic circles, quietly returned to teaching students in the North. His performances ceased entirely, but a single letter arrived at Baker Street from him some months later, unasked and unexpected. "Mr. Holmes, though you uncovered my shame, you also spared me destruction. I cannot thank you for that, for what is gratitude in the face of such unmasking? But I can say that I now teach with honesty, that I speak of accompaniment not as shadow work, but as art. You gave me that clarity, even through humiliation. Some men compose, others echo. I have accepted that I am the latter. C. Rowe." I read the letter aloud, and when I looked up, Holmes simply nodded once, his expression unreadable. That night, as the streets quieted once more, I asked him, "Would you take a case like this again?" Holmes stirred the fire before replying. "Cases of jealousy, vengeance, and misdirection? Certainly." "No," I said. "Cases where no crime is committed, only consequence." Holmes glanced over at me. "Those are the most difficult, Watson, because they demand more than deduction. They demand listening, feeling, and accepting that resolution is not always revelation." I let the fire's warmth fill the silence between us. Finally he spoke once more, almost to himself. "Do you know what makes a note resonate, Watson?" I shook my head. "It's not just the vibration. It's the pause that follows. The breath. The stillness that lets the sound settle. That is where the meaning lies." And with that he rose, set his violin gently into its case, and turned to the window, watching the lamplight flicker across the fog, as if listening one last time for a note long since played but never truly lost.